Hi guys, it's Mrs. Cottless. So we're going to do two videos this week. We're going to do a video on our new stuff and we're going to do a video of poetry analysis because I saw that that was really hard for you guys and you didn't really get to the depth that I would like to see you go to, and especially when you're taking a college class that I think you're going to need to go to. So we're going to look at how I would do a poetry analysis of The Raven, and then hopefully that's going to help you guys when you do poetry analysis again for me. So again, what I'm looking for is for you guys to, sorry, I need to plug my computer in, put some effort into this to really be looking for things. What I asked you to look for specifically were allusions in the poem, and some of you got a couple of them, but not others, so we're just going to go through it together. So what you're going to want to do, pause this video, grab a copy. It helps to print it out. So I actually have my printed copy with notes here. So you probably would like a printed copy too. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do anytime we're going to do poetry analysis is we kind of need to get in the poet's head. And so we need a little bit of background on our boy Edgar. Okay, so Poe is born in 1809, and he's born to two actor parents. They're both actors. By the time he's 3, he is orphaned, and he goes to live with John Allan, who lives in Richmond, and that's where we get the Edgar Allan Poe. And John Allan is kind of a mixed bag in terms of being a foster parent. So he's either spoiling Edgar rotten or he's punishing the daylights out of him. And there seems to be no consistency in that relationship. So he's sent to the best schools, he travels abroad, but there's never that like parent-child consistent relationship that you would like to have in your life. And he ends up at the University of Virginia, and in 1827, he ends up coming home. So at the time, the University of Virginia had really strict moral codes. So there was no drinking, there was no gambling, it was a lot like Liberty, you guys. No shenanigans, okay? But we're not really sure why Poe left, but he did have some gambling debts. He did do some drinking. So probably for not having the level of moral character that Thomas Jefferson would have liked to see in his students, Poe is sent back. It's also possible that at this time, John Allan wasn't paying his tuition because, like I said, that relationship kind of went up and down. So he returns to Richmond in 1827, and that relationship just goes completely south. And what he ends up doing is joining the army in Boston. So he moves to Boston, he joins the army, and at the same time, he releases his first collection of poetry, which is called Tamerlane and Other Poems. He gets married to his first cousin, who is 13 years old, and in 1847, she dies of tuberculosis. In 1849, he's preparing for his second marriage, and he's found kind of randomly in Baltimore, Maryland, basically unconscious, and he dies 4 days later. No one's really sure what he died of. It's kind of a mystery. So he's very well known for being kind of the father of modern short stories. He's known for his poetry. He's known for being kind of dark. And so some of his biggest contributions, I think, to the short story genre would be like The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat. And if you like his kind of dark melodrama, then you should take a look at his short stories also. So in addition to The Raven, he has another poem called Lenore, which talks about the ways to celebrate the memories of the dead. So talking about death, talking about the afterlife, talking about memory and heartbreak and all of those things. Those are things that Poe tends to thematically go towards. So Poe was originally buried in Baltimore, and you can still visit his original gravesite, and his body was later exhumed and removed. But what's really interesting about that is there was someone called the Poe Toaster, and for 7 decades, this person, and we think later their son, would come to Poe's grave on his birthday and pour himself a glass of cognac, which is a type of alcohol, and drink a toast to Poe, and then leave 3 roses in a particular pattern and the rest of the bottle of cognac and leave. And this person wore like a black cape and a black hat and a white scarf, and was never there for attention, never let the public know who he was. Sometimes would leave a note or a poem for Poe, and eventually disappeared. And some people think that the son died and didn't pass it on, but it ended up being on like an anniversary of Poe's death, so they think maybe that was their time to stop it. But Baltimore actually like hired a professional Poe toaster to keep it going as a tourist thing. So anyway, I think that's really interesting. So when we get into this poem, we have that background about Poe. And it's important to look at the timeline of when the poem was written. So as Poe is writing this poem, his first wife is dying of tuberculosis. And so the heartbreak of that loss and her impending death, like that's all going to play into this poem. Okay? So when we look at the physical aspects of the poem, which is the next thing we want to do, so we got some background, right? And we know what point in time in the author's life they're writing. And then we want to go on and look at the physical composition of the poem. So we have 18 stanzas to this poem. So remember, a stanza is kind of like a paragraph. And each stanza has 6 lines and the same rhyme scheme, which is A, B, C, B, B, B. Okay, A, B, C, B, B, B. And the 6th line is very short. And that actually, at the beginning of the poem, having those very short lines is setting us up for the nevermores that are going to come later in the poem. But having a very short line, just like having a very short sentence in prose, as you focus on those words, having a very short line in a stanza focuses you on those words in the very short stanza. And he puts it at the end, which makes it ring even more in your mind. Okay, another thing that happens is that lines 1 and 3 of each stanza have an internal rhyme scheme. So when we look, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weekend weary, and then in line 3, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, eagerly I wish the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow. So there's an internal rhyme scheme that happens in 1 and 3. I think that's it in terms of what I want to focus on from a physical composition of the poem perspective. So now what I want to do is I want to read through this poem and I want to understand what it's saying. Okay, so let's start with the first 3 stanzas. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Okay, so we're setting the scene here, and he's going to use a bunch of words to tell us how depressed he is, okay? Dreary, weak, weary. It's late, it's dark, it's bleak, it's December, it's cold. The fire's dying, he has sorrow, he's sad. All of these words are setting up a mindset and just the setting of the poem. Everything about this poem is dark, is heavy. Even the curtains are purple. We imagine them like some kind of a crushed velvet, like a heavy, dark. Everything about this poem should weigh down on you. Okay? So he is literally falling asleep at midnight in his chair reading, and he hears someone knocking and thinks it's a visitor. So in my head, this is someone that's not quite out of sleep yet and is kind of like, oh, there's someone knocking, and doesn't maybe realize how long he's been in there. It's midnight, but maybe he doesn't realize how late it is, because why would you have a visitor at midnight, right? Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore. for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. Okay, so he remembers this well. He's looking back on this episode that happened. And each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Even the fire is dying, but it's casting shadows. And he's wanting morning to come, because if you've ever had something really heavy in your life, it seems worse at night when you're alone and you're trying to sleep. And so he's just waiting for day to come. He's trying to pass the time. He'd been looking in these books for something to distract him from his grief, but he hasn't found anything. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, 'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more. So this is kind of like if you wake with a start and you heard something and you kind of get that panicky feeling. I think of the rustling of each purple curtain, kind of like if you're outside at night and the leaves rustle and you're like, what was that? But there's an extra level of him kind of panicking because he was half asleep. So he's repeating to himself, it's just someone coming to visit. That's all it is. There's nothing weird or creepy going on here. All right. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. So he, gets his wits about him and starts apologizing through the door to the person. I'm so sorry, you knocked so gently and I was asleep. But when he opens the door, there's nothing but darkness. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore, merely this, and nothing more. So it's just him. Maybe his fear earlier was because he thought maybe this is his love's ghost come back to visit him. But the only thing he gets when he asks for her is the echo of his own words. She's gone. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Well, now he's awake, and he still hears the tapping, and he goes, you know what? Silly me, it wasn't the door. I think it's the window, so let me go check it out. Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flit and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance he I can't even read, you guys. Made he. Not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mine of lord or lady perched upon my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. So he opens the window, and in flies this raven. And you guys have seen a raven before. They're big birds. They're black. They make that awful, like, kind of caw sound. They're typically bad omens in literature. And so this is one of our first symbols that we're going to see is this raven. So it's a raven for several reasons. First of all, ravens don't normally talk. But quoth the parrot nevermore would have been kind of like funny, and that's not the tone we're going for. Ravens are black and dark and ominous, and also it's odd for them to speak to you. And so all of those things come together to be part of the symbolism of this poem. Also Pallas. So if you didn't stop on Pallas, that's an allusion and a symbol. So Pallas is another name for Athena, and Athena is the goddess of wisdom. And so later in the poem, we're going to see that the narrator listens to this bird, thinks that this bird has some knowledge, because if he didn't think it had knowledge, he wouldn't get angry about what it was saying. And so having the bird perched on the head of wisdom, that's an important symbol in this poem. Um, Poe did say, we're going to go over all of these again, but Poe did say it was 18. I don't have the date, but in an interview, Poe stated that he used Pallas, not Athena, because he liked the sound better. So that's why he used that and not Athena. Okay, so the bird flies in and it's sitting on Athena's head, and Athena means wisdom. Then this ebony bird beguiling my said fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore, quoth the raven, nevermore. So the bird flies in and he's like, oh, you're not a weird ghosty, you're just a bird. Like, what's your name, bird? But he does have another allusion there, and it's to the night's Plutonian shore. And Plutonian, in this case, is referring to Pluto, or you might know him as Hades. And Hades would bring souls across the river Styx into hell. And so sitting on the shore, on Plutonian shore, is talking about kind of that shore in between the river Styx, in between life and death. And the raven says his name is Nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, which just means I was like, wow, the bird answered me. Though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. I have to say that no one else has ever had this experience of having a bird perched on their door and telling you that its name was Nevermore. That's all he's saying. But the raven sitting lonely on the placid bust spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, still I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. So the bird's perched up there and the guy's just like, whatever, it'll be gone by morning. Like other people have left me before too. Nothing is permanent. And the bird says, no, I'm not going to leave. Startled at the stillness broken by replies so aptly spoken. What gets him is that like everything was being very still. Even the bird was being very still until he said this and the bird responded. And not only did the bird respond, he responds aptly, which means that his reply made sense. He says, everyone leaves me, and the bird says, nevermore, which makes sense. Doubtless, said I, what it utters is only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. So, what Poe is saying here is, the narrator in this poem goes, oh, well, this is clearly the only thing it can say. It's just repeating what some unhappy master said all the time. And then he talks about disaster taking that master away and like the bird's just gotten out. Dirges are funeral songs. So again, we get that theme of death and dying in here. Then the next stanza. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. So he grabs a chair and he pushes it over and he sits it down in front of the bird. And when he says, beguiling all my fancy into smiling. I think what he's saying there is kind of like, how you smirk at something that you're like, this is just so ridiculous. Like, I think that's the kind of smile he has there. So he brings this over and he sits down and he has kind of a change where he's smiling at this bird. Like, this is such a ridiculous situation. But then he starts calling him grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous. So these are bad things. But he sits in front of him and he decides he wants to think about what the bird means by saying nevermore. So he decides to sit down and analyze what the bird meant. I don't frequently sit down and think about what birds mean by things. But he's saying, people always leave me, and the bird says nevermore. And he's like, well, what does it all mean? And where we'll get into a little bit of more with my analysis at the end, but my analysis is going to be a little different because I have a different worldview than you're going to get from most of the online analysis that you'll look up. So we'll talk about both, but for now we're going to look at what the poem's saying. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burn into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press on nevermore. So he's sitting in Lenore's chair, and maybe your parents are like this, where you've got like mom's chair and dad's chair. He's sitting in Lenore's chair, and he's sitting there and he's trying to figure out what this bird means. He feels like the bird is staring like into his heart, and he doesn't say anything because he doesn't want to say anything out loud and startle the bird or make the bird talk again. He's just being quiet. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer. And a censer, you guys should have hit this one. A censer is an incense boat, which is used during like Catholic Mass, or Episcopalians use them sometimes on Easter. I think just Easter. I don't think they use them at Christmas, but it's like a little ball, and you put the incense in it burning, and it's got strings, and you can go like this, and you send the smell throughout the room. And when you go to a service with incense, it doesn't really matter how big the room is. So I've been to the Basilica, the Shrine of the Basilica in DC for Easter Vigil, and it's huge. It's like a cathedral, and hundreds of people can sit inside, and one little priest goes with the incense, and all of the air becomes heavy with this sweet, sticky smell. And when you leave, your hair and your clothes, everything smells like incense. So it's pervasive. So perfumed by an unseen censer, swung by seraphim. And again, seraphim is an illusion, and the seraphim are the angels that actually sit in the presence of God, whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath led thee by these angels. He hath sent thee. Quaff, O quaff, this kind nepenthe, and forgot this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Okay, so nepenthe is another thing that you should have looked up. If you just knew this, I would be super impressed. But nepenthe is a potion that was used by the ancients to help people forget their sorrow, to forget their anguish. And so he's saying, listen, bird, I get this now. You were sent by God via these angels that are invisibly in the room. And can you please just give me the magic potion that you've been sent with to help me forget about Lenore, to forget my sorrow? And the raven says, nah. Okay, so this whole poem, this rhyme scheme, the way it's written, the short endings kind of moving you through, it kind of works up into a lather, kind of. So when we get to this next section, he's kind of worked himself into a mental frenzy, and the beat, the rhythm of the stanzas prior to this stanza move us along to that point, and we see him getting more and more and more and more escalated till we get here. So imagine him screaming in the middle of the night at this bird. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest toss thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted. Now, what's interesting here is we talk about the internal rhyme scheme of 1 and 3, and it doesn't happen here, okay? Because in the last stanza, then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer. We still have it, but here, prophet said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil. No rhyme. Desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted. Again, there's no internal rhyme scheme there. So he's had some kind of a mental thing, and we're showing that happening with the lack of internal rhyme scheme. Desolate yet all undaunted on this desert land, enchanted on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Okay, so balm in Gilead can be a couple of things. So there was an actual resin that was a balm of Gilead. It came from Gilead, which is in Israel. And some people think here that he's talking about, is there an actual balm that can heal his heart? If you have a Christian worldview, the literal question here is there something that can heal my soul? And Jesus is referred to as the balm in Gilead. And so it kind of depends on your worldview what he's talking about right here. But, is there something there? Is there something that can heal me? And the raven tells him, no. Prophet, I said, thing of evil, prophet still of bird or devil, by that heaven that bends us above, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden. Aden, you should have also flagged that. Aden is the Arabic word for Eden or paradise. So he's talking about heaven. It shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. So he's asking the bird, okay, I just asked you, is there balm? Is there something that can heal me? And you said no. So now I want to know, is there a paradise? Is there a heaven? And is Lenore in it? And the raven says, no. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting. Now, parting and upstarting rhymes. So we're getting back into that internal rhyme scheme. So we're kind of backing off of his complete break a little bit, but he's still angry. Get thee back into thy tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of the lie that thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart and take thy form from my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Okay, so again, I'm probably going to differ from most secular online interpretations of this, but for me, the raven here is doubt, right? So he's asking all these deep theological questions, can God heal me? Is there balm for my soul? Is there heaven? And is my loved one there? And he's sitting in what in my head is a library, right? So he's sitting there with all of these curious volumes of forgotten lore. He could have easily picked up a Bible and answered these questions, but instead he decides to ask a bird, which is ridiculous. But so for me, there's this subtext in this poem of doubt and of fear that had the narrator had faith, he wouldn't have experienced in this same way. And if he had been asking questions of the right people instead of asking questions of a bird, the outcome could have been very different. But again, that's me, that's my worldview. And poetry analysis does have to do with what the reader sees and interprets. So I get to say that if I want to. And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. Okay, so at this point he's saying these doubts, these demons within him have held him down so much that he's never going to be able to get back up out of them, which is just sad and unnecessary from our worldview. So for me, that's a big thing, is doubt, and is the comfort that we can receive from knowledge of the answers to these questions. And so I think that plays in a lot with how I interpret the poem. So again, let's go over a couple of the things. So hopefully you noted that the raven was a symbol. Ravens are black, ravens are ominous. A human could give rational answers, right? So he could have asked a pastor, a friend, a fellow writer. Excuse me for 1 second. But instead, the narrator opts to ask a bird that doesn't normally talk, big existential questions. And it happens that because his answers are apt, his answers are appropriate, even though it's the same one word every answer, he opts to listen to a bird. The next thing would have been Pallas, aka Athena, goddess of wisdom. The narrator asks the bird for wisdom, asks the bird for knowledge. And so it's appropriate that the bird is sitting on the goddess of knowledge, kind of giving the bird credibility almost. And clearly the narrator doesn't believe. So earlier in the poem, there's a stanza where he says, clearly this bird is repeating stock and store. This bird was taught this word and it's just repeating it. There's nothing behind it. But clearly he doesn't believe that, or he wouldn't get so angry, so upset, so depressed by the bird's answers. He actually thinks that this bird has some credibility, some reason that we should listen to him. And that might go back to the fact that he is perched on top of Athena. Midnight and December, that's a symbol that's used. So it sets the tone for us and gives us an actual time that's happening. But it's also, midnight is the end of the day. December is the end of the year. Winter is a time of death. All of these things are used to symbolize endings, to symbolize death, to symbolize, to symbolize that dark, kind of macabre that he's going for. Plutonian, we talked about, also known as Hades, Pluto, who took people across the river Styx to the shores of Hades or hell. Seraphim, one of the angels that stands in the presence of God. We talked about the censer. So there's a lot of religious symbolism that goes into the censer and into the smell permeating the room with the Holy Spirit and all of that, but we're going to skip that for now. Nepenthe, the potion used to forget sadness or sorrow, used by the ancients. Balm in Gilead. So we talked about how this can have two meanings depending on how you're reading this with your worldview, right? So balm in Gilead can be a literal physical resin asking for healing for his heartbreak. But balm in Gilead also refers to Jesus, who is the balm in Gilead that can heal. There's an old hymn that says there's a balm in Gilead that can make the wounded whole. There's a balm in Gilead that heals the sin-sick soul. And so depending on how you want to take that. And then Eden, the Arabic word for Eden or paradise, he's asking if Lenore is in heaven. So that is how we analyze a poem. And so what we did again was first we went and we looked for background on the author. We looked for what their life was like, if there were any particularly detrimental events that happened or any particularly good events that happened that would have influenced their writing. We look at specifically what was happening in their life at the time they were writing the work that we're examining. So for Poe, we know that at the exact time that he's writing this, his wife is dying of tuberculosis. And so some of those themes are going to come out in this poem. The next thing that we do is we look at the physical aspects of the poem. How many stanzas are there? What is the rhyme scheme? Is there internal rhyme within the lines? Is there anything particular about the length or the arrangement or anything at all about the physical composition of the poem? Okay, and where they deviate from that. So you remember when we got into the end of the poem, let's see, we have 18 stanzas, 18, 17. So in 15 and 16, stanzas 15 and 16, he breaks from that internal rhyme scheme. Why is he doing that? And then you want to go through and you want to read the poem for comprehension. So you want to make sure that you know what they're saying in each stanza of the poem. And you saw I did that in a couple of words. So you don't need to do a like verbatim translation from whatever century they're writing into modern English. You just need to be able to understand what's happening in there. If there are any words that seem important or themes that are repeated, you want to make a note of that. And then as you're reading, you also want to make a note of any symbols or allusions that are happening. And so we did that. We pulled out the symbols of December, of, the dying fire, of the fact that it's midnight, all of those types of symbols we pulled out. We noted that the raven can be a symbol as well. And then we pulled out the allusions. And so anytime that it talks about someone or something from other places in literature, in history, anything like that, you want to make sure you look at that as an allusion. Why would they add that to the poem? What is that adding or taking away from the characters in the poem? And that's why it's important to look up, who is Pallas? What does Plutonian mean? If we were meeting as a class, I would have given you guys flat out a pop quiz and been like, who's Pallas? What does Plutonian mean? I would have asked you, what's a seraphim? What's a censer? What is the balm in Gilead? What does Aiden mean? And I would have asked you that because as you're reading this poem, if you're reading it to analyze it, you should have looked those things up because you don't know what they mean. And so you should have looked them up. And that's a good way to know what you should be looking at as allusion. If you have to look it up because you're not sure what it is, it's probably something that they're pulling from an outside source. It's possible that there's words, especially if you're reading older poets, it's possible that there's words that you don't know that you need to look up, and that's okay. But in terms of what I would ask you if we were in class, I would ask you what all of these things mean that you would have needed to look up to find meaning. So that is how we do a poetry analysis, and I'm going to give you another one. I haven't decided yet what it's going to be, but by the time I put this up on Google Classroom, I will have decided. But I really take the time, make some notes on the side, write what it means. So I literally go through and can you see this? Okay, so I wrote, setting the scene, here are the words. I wrote what it means. He's closed in his room. I imagine a library, half asleep, here's a knock. I go down here. His dying fire cast shadows. He was hoping to take his mind off his lost love. I write things down the side. I make sure that I highlight things that I think are symbols or allusions so that I can go back to them. And I make myself notes while I'm reading. So that's what you should be doing. When you analyze a poem, you're gonna have to put some work in. This isn't something where you can just read it and instantly get it, and that's okay. And it's okay. I would encourage you to try and go through the poem yourself first and look up any allusions, look up any symbols that you think you see first. And then go and look at some online analysis. See what other people have said. See what actual English professors have said about this poem. See if you were on the right track. See if you had another idea. And it's possible. So like I said, if you Google what I see in this poem from a Christian perspective, you're probably not really going to find that. That doesn't make it wrong. I would just say, this isn't the way that most people look at this poem, but here's how I look at this poem. The way you look at it is not ever going to be wrong necessarily. But so it's not the way you read the poem and what it makes you think that's ever going to be right or wrong. But there are things that everyone should see. And in terms of identifying the allusions and identifying the symbols, you should be able to find those things. And if you can't find them, then you need to learn to look for help in finding them. And that might mean using Google to help you. Make sure you're finding good sources. Look for universities, look for schools, look for something where the source is going to be good. And you can always just mention, I read several analyses. I've been in my house a long time, you guys. But say, I read this analysis from this professor at the University of Virginia, and here's what he said. There's nothing wrong with needing help with this. You're new at it, and that's okay. All right, so I will give you another one of these to try. I want to see you guys put some effort into it. I know you're all spending like 20 hours a day playing video games. Put the work in. It'll be good for you. All right, guys, I will see you later for my second video, but that's it for Poe.